Jack Ellis had never been a fan of hospitals. Being a construction worker, he was used to scrapes and bruises, but this time was different. After a minor accident on the job, his doctor insisted he go to Mercy Hospital for surgery. The hospital itself had an old, eerie feel to it, almost as if it hadn't been touched in decades. The walls were sterile, too white and too cold, like they could swallow you whole. Jack noticed that the nights were unnervingly quiet. There was something about the way the shadows seemed to stretch down the long, empty hallways that made his skin crawl. On his first night after the surgery, Jack struggled to sleep. The distant hum of machines and the occasional footstep outside his door were the only sounds that kept him company. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, reminding him that everything should be normal. But there was an undercurrent of unease, something just wrong. It wasn't the pain or the discomfort from the surgery, it was the hospital itself. Jack tried to convince himself that it was just the usual post-surgery anxiety. Hospitals made everyone feel weird, right? As the hours dragged on, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt a presence lingering in the room, like a cold breath on the back of his neck. He brushed it off, thinking maybe the painkillers were playing tricks on his mind. "Get it together, man," he whispered to himself, trying to relax. But it was no use. That feeling wouldn't go away. There was something in this hospital, something that didn't belong. The following day, Jack felt more settled, but the strange feeling lingered. The nurses were kind but distant, like they knew something he didn't. Whenever he asked about the hospital's age or mentioned the odd silence at night, they changed the subject quickly, as if discussing it would summon something they didn't want to face. Jack let it slide, not wanting to be the paranoid patient. Still, that odd sense of dread remained, gnawing at him just beneath the surface. That evening, Jack lay in bed, trying to drift off to sleep, when he heard it for the first time, a faint, muffled cry, echoing from somewhere deep in the hospital. He jolted up, listening intently, but the sound vanished as quickly as it had come. Jack tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just another patient in pain or a trick of his ears. But deep down, he knew that wasn't right. The cry had felt off, like it didn't belong to someone alive. He tried to sleep again, but the restlessness returned. Every creak of the floor, every distant noise from the hallway seemed amplified. That hospital quiet, the kind that should have been comforting, now only added to the unease. Jack tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling, wondering why this place felt so wrong. There was no logical reason for it. He was just here to heal, to get back on his feet. Yet something in Mercy Hospital felt like it had other plans for him. Jack wasn't the type to scare easily. Years of hard labor had made him tough, almost numb to fear. But as the minutes ticked by and the cries continued to echo in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. He had a feeling this wouldn't be his last night battling whatever darkness lurked within the walls of this hospital. The second night at Mercy Hospital was when things started to really get under Jack's skin. The faint cries he had heard the previous night, they were louder now, much more distinct. There was no mistaking them. Agonized, haunting, as if someone was in unbearable pain. They echoed through the halls, bouncing off the walls, coming from somewhere Jack couldn't pinpoint. Lying in bed, staring at the door, he felt a shiver run down his spine. He wasn't imagining it this time. Someone, or something, was out there. Jack pushed the call button for the nurse, but when she arrived, her face grew pale as he mentioned the cries. "It's just the wind," she muttered quickly, eyes darting to the hallway. The way she said it, almost rehearsed, made Jack uneasy. She didn't believe what she was saying, and neither did he. "Wind doesn't sound like that," Jack replied, trying to push for more information, but the nurse hurriedly changed the subject, checked his vitals, and left the room without another word. Unable to shake his curiosity, Jack decided he wasn't going to spend another night just lying there, haunted by those sounds. When the hospital quieted down even further, he slipped out of bed and into the dimly lit hallway. The floor was cold beneath his feet, and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic mixed with something else. Something metallic, like blood. The cries had stopped for now, but the memory of them drove him forward. He needed to find the source. As he walked, Jack noticed how empty the hospital felt. The halls stretched on, seemingly endless, and each turn took him deeper into a part of the building he hadn't seen before. The further he went, the more the temperature dropped. He felt it in his bones, the unnatural cold, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The silence now was thick, oppressive, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. And then faintly, the cries started again. He followed the sound, his heartbeat quickening with each step. It led him to a deserted wing of the hospital, the kind of place where the lights flickered and dust coated every surface. The air was thick with neglect, and Jack had the strange sensation that no one had been down this hallway in years. At the end of the corridor, he saw a door, old, chipped, with a small sign that read "Burn Unit." He tried the handle, but it was locked. The cries grew louder now, almost frantic, like whoever, or whatever, was inside was desperately trying to be heard. Jack pressed his ear to the door, feeling the cold radiating from it. There was something horribly wrong behind that door, something that made every instinct in his body scream at him to turn back. But instead, he lingered, listening to the sounds of suffering on the other side, frozen with a sick sense of curiosity. A sudden thud against the door made Jack jump back, his heart pounding in his chest. He stood there breathless, staring at the door as if it would burst open any second. The cries had stopped, replaced by a heavy, unsettling silence. Jack turned to leave, the weight of what he had heard pressing down on him. Whatever was in that room wasn't just a forgotten patient. It was something else, something far worse, and it wasn't going to stay hidden for long. On the third night, Jack's nerves were completely shot. He could barely close his eyes without hearing the distant cries echoing through his mind. Sleep seemed impossible, but exhaustion finally took over. That is, until a new sound pulled him from the edge of slumber, a dragging, shuffling noise just outside his door. It was unmistakable, a slow, heavy movement, like something, or someone, was struggling down the hall. Jack's heart raced as he sat up in bed, straining to hear more. Then he caught a whiff of something foul, an acrid burnt odor that made his stomach turn. The smell grew stronger, so thick it felt like it was suffocating him. Jack forced himself to stand and peek through the narrow window of his hospital room door. His blood ran cold. There in the dimly lit hallway was a figure wrapped in filthy, blood-stained bandages. It moved slowly, each step labored, dragging its feet along the ground. The stench of burnt flesh clung to the air, so strong Jack had to cover his nose to keep from gagging. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched the figure creep closer. Panic surged through him. Jack's instinct screamed at him to bolt back to his bed, but he was rooted in place, unable to tear his eyes away from the horrifying sight. The bandaged figure continued its slow, agonizing march down the hallway, heading toward the locked door of the burn unit. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was the same presence he had sensed since his first night here. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't alive, at least not in any way that made sense. With shaking hands, Jack reached for the call button again, desperately summoning the nurse. When she arrived, the figure had already disappeared, leaving only the lingering stench of charred skin. Jack blurted out what he had seen, but the nurse's reaction was chilling. She paled, her eyes widening in fear. Without looking him in the eye, she whispered, "That patient. He died months ago, in a fire. They never found his body." Jack's heart sank. The way she said it, so matter-of-fact, yet filled with unspoken terror, told him everything he needed to know. The burned patient was more than just a tragic story. It was a haunting, a presence that refused to move on. The nurse left the room quickly, refusing to answer any more of Jack's questions. He was left sitting in his hospital bed, the faint scent of burnt flesh still hanging in the air, wondering what he had just witnessed. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of the bandaged figure burned into his mind, haunting him. He felt trapped, as though the hospital itself was keeping him there, forcing him to confront whatever horror lurked in its depths. The silence of the night felt heavier, the shadows darker, and the cold deeper. Jack knew he couldn't ignore this any longer. Whatever had appeared in the hallway wasn't just a one-time thing. It was coming back, and next time, It might not stop at the burn unit door. Jack had always thought of himself as rational, but now, faced with something beyond explanation, he felt that rationality slipping. There was something evil in this hospital, something that wouldn't let him rest until he understood its story. The days that followed were filled with dread. Jack couldn't escape the feeling that the burned patient was always near, lurking just out of sight. No matter where he went in the hospital, the faint smell of burnt flesh followed him, clinging to his clothes, his skin, as if marking him for something. Every time Jack thought he could breathe easy, that odor would hit his nostrils, sending shivers down his spine. He started seeing flashes of movement in his peripheral vision, dark shapes darting in and out of the shadows. But every time he turned to look, there was nothing there. Sleep became impossible. Jack's nights were filled with vivid, terrifying dreams. In each one, he found himself trapped in a room engulfed in flames. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with smoke, and the walls seemed to close in on him. And always, standing in the corner, was the bandaged figure, its face hidden but its eyes. Jack could feel those eyes, burning with agony and anger, boring into him. Each time he tried to escape the flames, the figure reached out, whispering for help. But Jack couldn't move. He would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart racing, the smell of smoke still fresh in the air. Desperate for answers, Jack began digging into the hospital's past. He spent hours researching old records, trying to find anything about the burned patient. What he found only made things worse. The man, whose name had been erased from most records, was a victim of a terrible fire that had swept through one of the hospital's older wings. He had been trapped inside, left to die in excruciating pain, his body never fully recovered. It was said that his spirit lingered, unable to find peace, wandering the halls in search of relief from his endless torment. Jack couldn't help but feel a growing connection to the story. The more he learned, the more he felt the burned patient's presence around him. It was as if the spirit knew Jack was trying to uncover the truth, and it wasn't happy about it. The nights grew worse, with the bandaged figure appearing in his dreams more frequently, its whispers growing louder, more desperate. The figure no longer stood in the corner, but hovered over Jack's bed, its skeletal hand reaching out, begging for help that Jack couldn't give. During the day, Jack tried to focus on his recovery, but the hospital felt like a trap. Every hallway, every room seemed to close in on him. The lights flickered more often now, and the temperature would drop suddenly, leaving Jack's skin cold to the touch. Nurses avoided him, their eyes filled with a silent fear they couldn't hide. They knew something was happening, but none of them dared to speak about it. Jack was alone in this, trapped in a place that seemed more alive with each passing day, as if the hospital itself was watching, waiting. It wasn't just the dreams anymore. Jack started seeing the burned patient during the day. At first, it was just fleeting glimpses, a flash of a bandaged arm disappearing around a corner, a shadowy figure standing at the end of a hallway. But soon, the sightings became more frequent, more real. Jack would walk down an empty corridor only to feel the temperature plummet, and there, standing in front of him, would be the figure. It never moved, never spoke, just stood there, watching him with those unseen eyes. Jack was sure of one thing: the patient wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. Jack's final encounter with the burned patient came on a night when the hospital was quieter than usual. The stillness was unnerving, even more than the usual late-night silence. Every creak, every whisper of air through the vents felt amplified. Jack had been trying to rest, but the scent of burnt skin had grown stronger, choking the air in his room. It was so thick that it felt like it was seeping into his very lungs. He knew the patient was near. His gut screamed it, and this time, he wouldn't just wait for whatever was coming. He needed to face it. Summoning the courage he barely had left, Jack pulled himself out of bed and ventured into the hallway. The temperature dropped immediately, freezing his breath in the air. The lights above flickered, casting long, jagged shadows that danced against the sterile walls. As he moved forward, the smell of burning flesh became unbearable, and that's when he saw it. The burned patient, standing at the far end of the hallway. Its bandaged face was tilted slightly, as if it had been waiting for Jack all along. For the first time, Jack saw the figure clearly, bathed in the dim, flickering light. The bandages were peeling, revealing raw, blistered skin underneath, blackened and twisted from the fire that had claimed it. Its eyes, though hidden beneath the wrappings, seemed to burn with something far worse than hatred: suffering. Pure, endless suffering. The patient took a step toward Jack, its movements slow, deliberate, as though every moment was a painful reminder of its agony. Jack froze, his body betraying him, every muscle locked in fear. The patient's skeletal hand reached for the bandages that covered its face, pulling them away with a deliberate slowness that made Jack's stomach turn. Beneath the layers of charred fabric was a face so grotesquely deformed, Jack nearly retched. The skin was melted, twisted into shapes that no longer resembled anything human, but it was the eyes that held Jack's gaze, eyes filled with eternal torment, pleading for release, but at the same time, brimming with fury. The burned patient stepped closer, whispering in a raspy, broken voice that sent chills down Jack's spine. "Help me. End this." Jack wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there, paralyzed, but he couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The air had grown so cold that it felt like his skin would crack under the weight of it. The patient was only a few feet away now, its blackened fingers reaching out, curling toward Jack's face. He could feel the cold radiating from its body, the smell of burning flesh filling his nostrils, making his stomach churn. And then, just as the patient's hand was about to touch him, everything went dark. Jack woke up days later, back in his own home. There was no explanation for how he got there, no memory of leaving the hospital. His first thought was that it had all been some horrible nightmare, but the scent of burnt flesh still lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the patient's melted face, its eyes filled with unbearable suffering. The worst part? Jack knew that this wasn't over. The burned patient wasn't done with him. Now, every time Jack steps foot in a hospital, whether for a routine checkup or to visit a friend, the smell of burnt flesh returns. It follows him, seeping into his clothes, his skin, until he's certain that the patient is near again. Sometimes he hears faint, distant screams echoing through the hospital halls, just like before. He knows that the burned patient is still out there, wandering the halls, waiting for someone to finally end its suffering. But Jack also knows one terrifying truth: that patient might be waiting for him to return, and next time, there may be no escape. Olivia Clark had never imagined she'd end up in a psychiatric ward, yet there she was, telling her story from the cold, sterile walls of St. Augustine's. A 32-year-old graphic designer, Olivia had always been a bit of a perfectionist, constantly pushing herself until her anxiety finally broke her down. She figured a place like this would offer some relief, a break from the overwhelming world outside. But what she found inside those walls was anything but comforting. From the moment she stepped through the doors, there was this oppressive weight in the air, like the whole building was watching her, waiting. The other patients didn't exactly ease her mind either. She'd seen hospitals before, of course, but this one felt off. The hallways were always too dark, even during the day, with lights that flickered like they were tired of keeping up the pretense of normalcy. Patients shuffled around like ghosts, and Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beneath the surface. But there was one patient, in particular, that stood out. A man, maybe in his 40s, who always sat alone in the corner of the common room wearing a surgical mask. No one talked to him, no one looked at him, and that was the strangest part. Like they didn't even notice he was there. At first, Olivia thought it was just her own paranoia acting up. She was anxious after all. But the way the man sat, so perfectly still, like a statue, made her uneasy. It was as if his presence sucked the energy out of the room. She tried to focus on her therapy sessions, tried to ignore the way her skin prickled every time she passed him. Yet the feeling that something was terribly wrong with him, with this place, gnawed at her. It was the way his eyes would follow her, or at least she thought they did. She couldn't be sure, but deep down, she knew she wasn't imagining it. Olivia asked one of the nurses about him once, hoping for some reassurance, but the response only fueled her growing sense of dread. The nurse just gave her a quick, tight smile, shrugged, and said, "He's been here for a long time." That was it. No name, no explanation. Just that cold, empty phrase that left more questions than answers. Olivia felt her stomach drop. Why wouldn't anyone tell her more? Why did everyone seem to pretend he wasn't even there? The nights were the worst, though. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the ward seemed to change. The sounds of distant footsteps echoed through the halls, but they never seemed to belong to anyone. Olivia would lay awake in her bed, heart racing, listening to the silence between those echoes, half expecting something or someone to appear. It was ridiculous, she told herself, but that didn't stop the pit of fear from growing in her gut every night as she tried to sleep. That man, that silent, masked figure, was always on her mind. Every morning, Olivia told herself she was just overthinking things. She was in a psychiatric ward for a reason, after all. It was easy to let your mind play tricks on you in a place like this, but something about the way the man sat, unmoving, with his mask covering half of his face, never felt like a trick. It felt real, too real, and every time she passed him, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for something, or worse, waiting for her. Days passed, and Olivia started to grow more uneasy. The other patients were distant, withdrawn, but that man, he never seemed to change. The routine, the silence. It was all starting to blur together, like she was trapped in a bad dream she couldn't wake up from. The longer she stayed, the more she felt like she was slipping into something she couldn't crawl back out of. And still, the man in the mask sat there, watching. It was in the second week when everything shifted for Olivia. She had finally started to settle into the monotonous routine of the ward. Group sessions, medication, restless nights. The masked man had remained a quiet fixture in the background, but she tried her best to ignore him. Then one night, something happened that she couldn't ignore. It was around 3 a.m. when Olivia woke up suddenly, her skin cold and clammy. At first, she thought it was just another bout of anxiety, but when her eyes adjusted to the dim light of her room, she saw him. He was standing at the foot of her bed, completely still, the masked man, the very same one she had seen in the common room day after day. Only now, in the eerie moonlight filtering through the small window, his presence was much more unsettling. His eyes caught the light just enough for her to notice the glint, a shine that wasn't quite human. It was like staring into something hollow, something wrong. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat tightened as if the air itself had turned to stone. Olivia couldn't move. She lay there frozen, her heart hammering in her chest as the man just stood there, staring. Then, without warning, he began to whisper. The sound was low, barely audible, like wind moving through dead leaves. At first, she couldn't understand the words. They were in a language she had never heard before. Something ancient, something full of malice. It wasn't just the words that terrified her. It was the way they seemed to seep into her bones, chilling her from the inside out. The darkness in the room felt thicker, heavier, pressing down on her chest. The longer she listened, the more Olivia felt her consciousness slip away, like the man's whispers were pulling her into some kind of void. She wanted to fight it, wanted to scream, to run, to do anything. But she couldn't. It was as if the very air had turned against her, trapping her in her own bed. Her vision blurred as the whispering grew louder, more insistent. Then, everything went black. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was the flicker of something fiery in his eyes, like embers burning deep in the darkness behind his mask. When she woke up the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the window, and the man was gone. Her room looked exactly the same as it always did, quiet, sterile, ordinary. But Olivia knew that what had happened wasn't some nightmare. She could still feel the weight of his presence, lingering like a shadow in the corners of the room. Shaken, she told the nurses about it, hoping for some kind of explanation, some reassurance. But their responses were frustratingly dismissive. One of them even chuckled softly, as if she was overreacting. It was probably just a dream, they said. But Olivia knew better. The rest of the day passed in a haze of confusion and fear. Olivia kept expecting to see the man again, lurking in the hallways or in the common room, but he didn't show. Still, she couldn't shake the memory of his eyes, the way they had glowed with that unnatural light. She started questioning everything. Had she imagined it? Was her anxiety getting worse? But deep down, she knew what she had seen was real, and that terrified her more than anything. That night, Olivia lay in bed with her heart racing, her mind spinning with thoughts she couldn't control. Every small creak in the building, every flicker of the lights, made her jump. She was too scared to close her eyes, afraid of what she might see if she did. But the exhaustion eventually caught up with her, and before long she drifted into an uneasy sleep, the memory of his whispering voice echoing in her ears. The days that followed were a blur of mounting dread for Olivia. She tried to convince herself that it was just an isolated incident, some strange hallucination brought on by her anxiety and the stress of being in the ward. But the truth gnawed at her, and the fear began to cling to her like a second skin. Every night she would lie awake listening for any hint of those whispers, expecting at any moment to see the masked man standing over her again. The feeling that she was being watched became unbearable, like invisible eyes followed her every move. It wasn't just at night either. During the day, Olivia couldn't escape the growing sense that something was horribly wrong. Shadows in her room seemed to stretch just a little too long, darkening the corners where the light should have reached. Sometimes, out of the corner of her eye, she would see shapes moving, flickering like they weren't really there. But every time she turned to look directly, they were gone. The nurses continued their routines, oblivious, but Olivia felt like she was living in a different reality, one where the ward itself had begun to twist and contort around her. Her dreams became a battleground. Almost every night the masked man appeared in her sleep, but in these dreams he wasn't passive. He would remove his mask, slowly, painfully, revealing a face that wasn't fully human. His skin was twisted and burned, but the most horrifying part was his eyes. They were hollow, empty, yet somehow burning with something primal, something that felt ancient. Olivia would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The dreams felt too real, and every time they left her more drained, more afraid to close her eyes again. The other patients began to keep their distance from her. Where they once exchanged polite, if vacant glances, now they seemed to avoid her entirely. Olivia noticed them whispering to one another when they thought she wasn't looking, casting furtive glances in her direction as though she had become a contagion, something to fear. Even the nurses seemed colder, more distant. It was as if they all knew something that she didn't, something they weren't telling her. She felt more alone than ever, trapped in her own fear with no one to turn to. As the days dragged on, Olivia's anxiety spiraled out of control. She started skipping meals, too afraid to leave her room, too afraid to step into the common areas where the masked man might be lurking. But even in the confines of her room, she could feel his presence, could hear the faint echo of his whispered words, just at the edge of her hearing. It was as if he was always there, just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to appear again. The weight of his unseen presence pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. Olivia couldn't take it anymore. She tried talking to the nurses again, but their blank expressions and dismissive reassurances only deepened her sense of isolation. One nurse even hinted that perhaps Olivia was imagining things, that maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. But Olivia knew better. She knew what she had seen, what she had felt. The man in the mask wasn't just a figment of her imagination. He was real, and he was getting stronger. And the worst part? He was feeding off her fear. Every night he came closer, the darkness around him growing thicker, more suffocating. She became convinced that the man, or whatever he truly was, wasn't just haunting her for no reason. He wanted something from her, and the more fear she felt, the more powerful he became. There was no escape, no safe place where she could hide from him. Even in the daylight, when the ward seemed somewhat normal, Olivia could still feel his eyes on her, could still hear his voice in the back of her mind. And she knew that sooner or later, he would come for her again. By this point, Olivia had reached her breaking point. Desperate for answers, she began searching for anything that might explain what was happening to her. The ward had become suffocating, the walls closing in on her as if they were alive, watching her every move. There had to be something, some record, some story that could shed light on the masked man's terrifying presence. Late one night, when the ward was quieter than usual and the nurses were distracted, she decided to sneak into the restricted area of the hospital. It was risky, but she had no other choice. Olivia made her way down a dark corridor she had never noticed before, the air growing colder with each step. Her heart pounded as she slipped through the door marked "Staff Only," praying no one would catch her. The room was dimly lit and filled with old filing cabinets, dusty and forgotten. She began rifling through the files, her fingers trembling as she searched for anything that might give her a clue. And then, after what felt like hours, she found it, a file labeled Patient Nurzo 43. Her blood ran cold as she recognized the face in the attached photo. It was the man in the mask. The file detailed the story of a patient who had been admitted years ago after a horrific accident, a fire that had left him severely disfigured. He wore the surgical mask to hide the burns that had scarred his face beyond recognition. But the file went deeper than that. There were reports from nurses and doctors about strange occurrences during his stay, equipment malfunctioning, lights flickering, and other patients reporting dark figures lurking in their rooms at night. The most disturbing part? The man had died under mysterious circumstances, but no one could explain how. His body had never been found. As Olivia read through the file, a chilling realization settled over her. The man wasn't just a ghost, he was something far worse. The fire had twisted him, not just physically but spiritually, turning him into a dark entity that fed on fear and despair. The mask wasn't just hiding his disfigurement, it was a symbol of what he had become. And now, he was using the ward as his hunting ground, preying on the vulnerable and weak, drawing power from their terror. Olivia's hands shook as she pieced it all together. He had been waiting for someone like her, someone whose fear he could consume. But the more she read, the more Olivia realized that this wasn't a new occurrence. Over the years, there had been several reports of patients experiencing similar encounters, though none had survived long enough to tell their full story. Some had disappeared without a trace, while others had simply gone mad, driven to insanity by the relentless torment. The ward had been covering it up, burying the reports and chalking it up to psychological episodes. Olivia felt sick to her stomach. They knew. The staff knew about him, and yet they did nothing to stop it. As the weight of the truth settled in, Olivia felt a cold chill run down her spine. It wasn't just the masked man she had to fear, it was the ward itself. This place, with its dark history and hidden secrets, was a breeding ground for the supernatural. The masked man was just the latest in a long line of horrors that had taken root here. And the worst part? Olivia knew that there was no escape. The masked man had chosen her, and he wasn't going to let her go. Not until he had consumed every last bit of her fear. The revelation left Olivia feeling hollow, like the walls of the hospital were closing in on her. She knew that her time was running out, that the masked man was growing stronger with each passing day, and now that she had uncovered the truth, there was no going back. He wouldn't stop until he had her. She had to act fast, had to find a way out before it was too late. But deep down, Olivia knew that escaping the ward wouldn't be enough. The masked man had marked her, and no matter where she went, he would follow. Convinced that her only chance of survival was to leave the ward, Olivia began making plans to discharge herself. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to get out while she still could. The masked man's presence was everywhere now. She could feel him lurking just beyond her vision, his whispers growing louder each night, his cold breath brushing against her skin. The ward had become a prison, not just physically, but mentally. And Olivia knew that if she didn't leave soon, she would end up like the others, lost to the darkness. Olivia spoke to the head nurse, pretending to be calmer than she felt, insisting that she was ready to go home. She could barely contain the desperation in her voice, but the nurse seemed satisfied. They arranged her discharge papers for the next morning, and Olivia felt a flicker of hope. Just one more night, she told herself. One more night, and she would be free. But as the day wore on, that hope began to crumble. The atmosphere in the ward grew thicker, heavier. It was as if the walls themselves knew she was planning to leave, and they didn't want her to go. That night, Olivia lay in bed, wide awake, her eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement in the darkened room. She could hear the faint creak of footsteps outside her door, slow and deliberate. Her heart raced as she pulled the blankets tighter around her, praying that this time he wouldn't come. But deep down, she knew he would. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, and then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. Olivia's breath hitched in her throat as the temperature in the room plummeted. He was here. Olivia's entire body froze as the masked man stepped into the room, his presence more suffocating than ever before. He moved slowly, deliberately, his glowing eyes fixed on her, burning with a terrifying intensity. She could feel his gaze piercing through her, draining the warmth from her body. He didn't speak this time. He didn't need to. His silence was far more terrifying. The air around him seemed to pulse with dark energy, like a living thing, feeding off the fear that radiated from her. She could barely breathe, her chest tight with terror. As he approached the bed, Olivia's body refused to move. The weight of the darkness around him pinned her down, making it impossible to even scream. His breath was cold against her skin, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a low, guttural whisper that sent chills down her spine. "You can't leave," he said, the words dripping with malice. "You belong to me now." Olivia's heart sank as she realized the truth. It didn't matter if she left the ward. He would follow her wherever she went. She had been marked, and there was no escape. In a desperate act of survival, Olivia mustered every ounce of strength she had left and forced herself to move. She leaped out of bed, sprinting toward the door, her legs shaking beneath her. She didn't stop to look back as she tore through the hallways, her breath ragged, her vision blurry with panic. The ward was eerily quiet, the walls echoing with her footsteps, but she could feel him behind her, his presence looming, closing in. Every step she took felt heavier, as though the building itself was pulling her back. Olivia burst through the front doors of the hospital, gasping for air as she stumbled into the cool night. She had made it. She was free. But as she stood there, panting and shaking, something inside her told her that it wasn't over. The cold, empty feeling that had settled in her chest hadn't left. And then she heard it. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind. His voice. "I'll always find you." Olivia's blood ran cold as she realized the terrible truth. She could run, but she would never escape him. He was always waiting. Henry Cooper arrived at the hospital with a weight on his chest that was more than just the illness. He was a tough guy, used to working long hours as a construction worker, but this time something was off. The hospital wasn't like any place he'd been before. It sat on the edge of nowhere, tucked away from the main roads, and even though it was the middle of the day, the place felt as dead as night. Empty rooms, flickering lights, and a silence that seemed to stretch forever. The staff was polite enough, but there was something weird about the way they rushed through their tasks, barely making eye contact. Once Henry was settled in his room, he noticed how unusually quiet the ward was. Not the kind of quiet that brings peace, though. This silence had a weight to it, pressing down on him. He chalked it up to exhaustion at first, figuring he was just tired from being sick. But as he lay there, his body aching with every breath, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't really alone. Sure, there were nurses coming in and out, but it was more than that. Something in the air felt wrong. He didn't know what yet, but it gnawed at the back of his mind. That first night, the hospital's strange vibe only got worse. As the lights dimmed and the world outside faded into darkness, Henry started hearing things. At first it was faint, just a distant, almost imperceptible sound. But the more he listened, the clearer it became. Moaning. It wasn't from any of the nearby rooms as far as he could tell, but it felt close, like it was right outside his door. The sound was low and drawn out, like someone was in pain. He tried to convince himself it was just another patient, But there was something eerie about the way it echoed down the empty halls. Henry tossed and turned, trying to get comfortable, but the sound wouldn't leave him. His body ached from the sickness, but his mind couldn't rest. The moaning came in waves, getting louder, then fading, but never stopping. He even tried calling the nurse a couple of times, but by the time she arrived, the noise had gone. Each time, she looked at him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, like she was hiding something. She told him the ward was mostly empty tonight and that he should get some rest, but Henry wasn't buying it. By the time the clock ticked past midnight, the sound wasn't just moaning anymore. Now there were other noises, strange clicks and faint thumps, almost like footsteps in the distance. His heart raced, and he couldn't tell if it was the fever or the fear creeping in. Something was definitely wrong here, and no one was talking about it. Henry wanted to get up, to check the hallway for himself, but his body wouldn't let him. Every breath felt heavier, every movement a chore. He was stuck in that bed, trapped with his racing thoughts. Eventually, Henry drifted in and out of sleep, but the sounds never stopped. Each time he woke, the moaning was still there, accompanied by those unsettling noises that now felt closer than ever. He tried telling himself it was all in his head, that his fever was making him hear things, but deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. Something was happening here, something he couldn't explain. As the night dragged on, he lay there, too weak to move, too scared to sleep, wondering what the hell he'd gotten himself into. As the second night closed in, Henry knew sleep wasn't coming easy. His breathing was still labored, but it wasn't just the illness keeping him awake now. That strange moaning had returned, louder this time, and something else had joined it. It started with a faint clink, barely noticeable at first, but it soon grew louder, more distinct. The unmistakable sound of chains dragging across the floor echoed through the empty halls. Henry's heart pounded in his chest, each clank sending a chill down his spine. Henry lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out if it was all in his head. Maybe the fever was playing tricks on him, right? But every time the sound of the chains dragged through the hall, it felt real. Too real. He pressed the call button for the nurse, his hand trembling. When she arrived, he could see the worry in her eyes as he explained the noises. She didn't even bother checking the hall this time, just gave him the same nervous smile and assured him it was nothing. But her face was pale, and Henry could tell she was hiding something. The hours dragged on, and the sounds persisted, relentless. The moaning, the chains, and now something even more disturbing. What sounded like soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing outside his door. Henry's breath hitched. He knew there weren't supposed to be any other patients in the ward, so who, or what, was making those noises? He wanted to call for the nurse again, but what would that accomplish? She'd just brush him off like she did before. So Henry lay there, helpless, feeling trapped by both his illness and the growing terror outside his room. By the middle of the night, the noises grew louder, almost unbearable. The chains weren't just being dragged anymore. They were slamming against the floor like someone, or something, was angry. The footsteps grew heavier, and now there were more of them. It wasn't just one set of feet anymore. It was many, shuffling, pacing, circling his room like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. Henry's pulse raced. He tried to tell himself it was his imagination, but deep down, he knew better. Something was out there. Unable to bear it any longer, Henry forced himself to sit up, his chest burning with each breath. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, wincing at the effort it took just to stand. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he had to know. He had to see what was making those sounds. Slowly, cautiously, he shuffled toward the door, his hands trembling as they reached for the handle. His heart pounded in his ears as he prepared himself for whatever was waiting on the other side. But when he opened the door, the hallway was empty. No sign of anyone, no chains, no footsteps, just the dim, flickering lights casting long shadows along the sterile white walls. For a moment, Henry almost believed it had all been in his head. Maybe the fever really was messing with him. But just as he was about to close the door, he heard it again. A deep, guttural moan, closer than before, and then the chains. They weren't outside the door anymore. They were inside, somewhere in the dark corners of his room, lurking just out of sight. Henry slammed the door shut, backing away as his chest tightened with fear. Whatever it wasn't just in the hallway anymore. It was with him, in the room, waiting. He crawled back into bed, pulling the covers up to his chin, trying to convince himself that morning would come soon, that the nightmare would end. But the chains dragged closer, and the soft footsteps resumed, pacing around his bed. The next morning, Henry woke up groggy and exhausted. His chest still burned from the illness, but his mind was racing. The events of the night before wouldn't leave him alone, and he needed answers. The moaning, the chains, the footsteps, it all felt too real to ignore. The nurses had been avoiding his questions, but there had to be more to this hospital than they were letting on. Henry knew he couldn't just sit there and wait for whatever was haunting him to come back. He had to find out what was really going on. Later that afternoon, during a brief moment when the ward was quiet, Henry managed to strike up a conversation with one of the older nurses. She had been working at the hospital for years and seemed a little more open than the others. Her face softened when he asked about the sounds, and she finally let out a sigh. "This place, it's got a history," she said, lowering her voice. Henry leaned in closer, his heart pounding as she began to explain. Years ago, during a local war, the hospital hadn't been used for healing. It had been a prison. Henry's blood ran cold as the nurse described how prisoners of war had been kept in the very rooms where he now lay. They had been tortured, shackled to the walls, and left to die in their cells. The ward had been sealed off for decades after the war, but as the town grew and space became scarce, the hospital had reopened it to care for patients. No one talked about it, but everyone knew. Those who died there, their spirits never left. Henry's heart pounded in his chest. The chains, the moaning. It all made sense now. The nurse's voice trembled as she told him about the worst of it. The prisoners who died in agony were never given proper burials. Their bodies had been discarded, left to rot, their souls trapped in the cold, unforgiving walls of the hospital. No one ever spoke of it publicly, but the staff knew better. They had all heard the stories of patients disappearing, of shadows moving in the dark corners of the hospital, of voices that echoed down the halls at night. The nurse looked at Henry with wide eyes. "You have to ignore it," she whispered. "Whatever you hear, whatever you see, don't engage with it." But how could he ignore it now? Henry's mind raced with the knowledge that the hospital was built on suffering and death. The chains he'd heard in the night were real. They had belonged to men who had been tortured, who had died angry and in pain. And now those same spirits were still there, restless, seeking something or someone to release their fury upon. Henry swallowed hard, his chest tightening with fear and a deep sense of unease. He was in their territory now, and there was no escaping that fact. As the nurse left the room, Henry lay back in his bed, staring up at the ceiling, the weight of what he'd just learned pressing down on him. His mind churned with fear and uncertainty. If the spirits of those tortured prisoners were still here, what did they want? Why hadn't anyone tried to put them to rest? And more importantly, why had they been drawn to him? His illness, which had once felt like the most pressing concern, now seemed like a minor detail in comparison to the horrors he was uncovering. Henry knew that whatever was happening, it wasn't going to stop on its own. The spirits were there for a reason, and it was clear they weren't going to let him rest. That night, Henry felt the weight of the hospital's dark past pressing down on him like never before. The air in his room was thick with the smell of decay, and the temperature seemed to drop, even though the heater was running. He pulled the thin hospital blanket tighter around himself, trying to shake off the chill, but no amount of warmth could push away the creeping dread. As the lights dimmed once again, the now familiar moaning returned, louder and more anguished than ever. The chains clanked against the floor in the hallway, and Henry's breath caught in his throat. This time, though, the sounds didn't stay outside his door. They moved closer, seeping into his room like a thick fog. Henry lay frozen in his bed, too weak to move, too terrified to even cry out for help. The voices started then, soft, raspy, whispering in a language he couldn't understand. Their words twisted and coiled in the air, filling his mind with a sense of overwhelming dread. Whatever they were saying, it wasn't friendly. It was angry, hostile, and filled with malice. Henry's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing louder in his ears. Suddenly, the moaning and clanking of chains stopped. The room fell into a deafening silence, so heavy that it felt as if the air itself had been sucked out. Henry held his breath, waiting, listening. Then from the darkness beside him, he heard it. A low, cold voice, whispering so close to his ear that he could feel the icy breath on his skin. "You're one of us now," it hissed, and Henry's blood ran cold. He turned his head slowly, his muscles stiff with fear, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, empty room, and the lingering feeling that something, or someone, was watching him. Henry's hands shook as he pulled the covers up to his chin, his heart racing. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in on him, as if the spirits were closing in, suffocating him with their presence. His body was weak, his chest heavy with both the illness and the fear that gripped him. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs wouldn't move. It was as if the very bed he lay in had become his prison, trapping him in this nightmare. The voices started again, louder this time, circling him, filling the room with a haunting, otherworldly chorus. As the night dragged on, the temperature in the room dropped even further, and Henry could see his breath in the air. He was no longer alone in the room. The shadows moved, shifting and twisting at the edges of his vision, just out of reach but unmistakably there. The chains clanked again, this time inside the room, dragging slowly across the floor, as if whatever was attached to them was crawling toward him. Henry's pulse quickened. He could feel it now, something cold, something heavy, creeping closer, getting ready to claim him. Then came the touch. It was faint at first, like a soft brush against his ankle, but it quickly grew firmer, colder. The chains rattled again, and Henry could feel the weight of something tugging at his leg, pulling him down. His hands gripped the edges of the bed, his knuckles white with fear. He tried to pull away, but the force grew stronger, yanking him harder. He gasped, his body jerking as the invisible hands tightened their grip, pulling him closer to the floor. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness, lost in the void that had overtaken the room. As the night wore on, Henry's strength faded, his body too weak to fight back any longer. The voices, the chains, the cold, creeping presence, it all blurred together in a haze of terror and exhaustion. His mind swirled with fear, his vision darkening as the room around him seemed to close in. He was trapped, surrounded by the spirits of the dead, their tortured souls desperate to drag him down with them. And in that moment, Henry knew there was no escaping the hospital's curse. The next morning, Henry woke with a jolt, drenched in sweat. His body felt like it had been through a war, every muscle aching from the tension of the night before. The cold grip of the spirits still lingered on his skin, and his mind raced with the memories of the night's horrors. He needed to get out. He couldn't stay in this hospital another second. The chains, the voices, the touch, they were real, and if he stayed, they'd claim him for good. He fumbled for the call button, desperation driving him as he begged the nurse to discharge him immediately. The doctors didn't believe him, of course. They dismissed his pleas as the ramblings of a fevered mind, insisting that no one else had heard the noises he described. But Henry didn't care. He knew what he had experienced, and he wasn't sticking around to wait for it to happen again. With every breath, his sense of urgency grew. He signed the discharge papers, his hands trembling as he scribbled his name. As soon as he was free, he limped out of the hospital, his body weak, but his determination stronger than ever. He was out, but he wasn't safe. Once home, Henry felt a brief moment of relief. The hospital was far behind him now, and the sunlight filtering through his windows gave him a false sense of security. He convinced himself it was over. But that night, as he lay in his own bed, the familiar sound returned. It started softly, almost like a memory. The clinking of chains, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing minute. His heart raced as the realization hit him. He hadn't escaped. The spirits had followed him. The hospital may have been the origin, But whatever haunted him was now part of his world, no matter where he went. As the chains dragged across the floor of his bedroom, Henry shot upright in bed, his pulse quickening. The darkness around him felt alive, filled with the same cold, malicious presence that had surrounded him in the hospital. He could hear the voices again, whispering in the same ancient, eerie language. They weren't just in the room, they were in his head, creeping into his thoughts, twisting them with fear and paranoia. He tried to tell himself it wasn't real, but deep down, he knew. The spirits weren't done with him. They had latched onto him, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. The sound of the chains grew closer, now unmistakably loud, as if they were being dragged right beside his bed. Henry's breath caught in his throat as the weight of their presence pressed down on him. He could feel the same cold fingers from before, brushing against his skin, gripping his ankle once more. Panic set in as he kicked wildly, trying to free himself from the invisible force. But it was no use. The chains clattered, and the presence grew stronger, pulling at him with a relentless, bone-chilling determination. Henry scrambled out of bed, stumbling across the room in a desperate attempt to escape. But the chains followed him, clinking and dragging, never letting him out of their reach. He ran to the door, flinging it open, but even as he stepped into the hallway, the sound persisted. The voices echoed around him, growing louder and more insistent. "You're one of us now," they whispered, the words twisting his gut with terror. No matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, the spirits were with him. There was no escape. As Henry collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath, he realized the horrifying truth. This was his life now. The spirits had claimed him, and they wouldn't rest until he joined them. The chains, the voices, the cold creeping touch, they would follow him everywhere, pulling him deeper into their world. And as the darkness closed in around him once again, Henry understood that he was never truly free. The hospital might have let him go, but its spirits never would.